Hey Max, I thought I'd just do a quick video to show you some of my drum processing and give you an idea of how I go about things. It might help you if you carry on doing your sort of mixing stuff. You mentioned that you use Reaper, so do I. So some of this is going to transfer directly across, and some of it won't because you won't have the same plugins as me, but I think you'll find it useful anyway. So, here's your Feeling These Feelings. We've got, obviously, the full mix here. Here's the drum tracks. Now, let's take it all right back to completely unprocessed. So this is what it sounds like, completely unprocessed, just panned and leveled. It's a pretty good drum track actually, not bad at all. But let's give you an idea of what I do. We'll start with the overheads. There's not really much I do to these actually. Just pan them directly left and right. And then a little bit of EQ and compression and some dynamics processing. So there you go. You can hear it's not much different. It's just a little bit less, a little bit more compressed, a little bit less dynamic range. And what I've got on here is just, this is like a console emulator, so it just sounds like putting it through an old console. We've got some EQ, just taking some of the low mids out so it's not muddy at all. And here we have it's a saturation model. There is a JS saturation effect directly in Reaper that will do a similar sort of job. So let's just take these in and out and sort of show you. So first the console, doesn't really do much, you don't need this, to be fair, it's just part of this plugin, which is the Slate mix rack, and then the EQ taking some of those low mids out. And then dynamics processing, this just basically, it's a little bit of a distortion, a little bit of compression, it just makes things have a little bit rounder, sort of heavier feel. And then compression just takes the edge off of like the really hard hits. So that's overheads. And snare, we do a fair amount to the snare actually. So take all these out so you can hear it first. So first we do gating. So we just put a gate on. This is called Silencer by Black Salt Audio, but you can use the regate thing as well, but this one's specifically for drums. So that just takes all the cymbals out of the background. If I turn it on properly. So you can see that takes the majority of the cymbals out of the background, so it isolates the snare sound so that you can then process it. Sorry, I just need to cough, I'm a little bit ill. If I mute myself and don't say anything for a while, it's just because I'm coughing. And then this, we'll come to this later, regate. This is how I trigger the MIDI drums that reinforce both the bass drum, the toms, and the snare. But we'll come back to that later. Next is transient shaping. Now you might not have heard of what transient shaper does, but a transient shaper basically determines when something hits and you get that big peak in audio, which is a transient, how loud that transient is and how long that transient lasts. So you can see here, if I take it off, it's a lot flatter. But then I've got here, the attack is how loud that peak is, so I'm really pushing that up, so there's a big impact to the snare drum when it hits. And then sustain here I've got, which is sort of how long that transient lasts. If I take it right down, it makes the snare hit really short and sharp, which is fine. So it's very loud, but there's not much tone to it afterwards. So we put this up here. Then we have a little bit more of that sort of like woody, sort of longer ring of the snare afterwards. And we're just doing a little bit of EQ, taking the extreme lows out of everything. some of the low mids, and then a tiny bit of the extreme highs. So we're just sort of focusing the snare in that kind of that mid region. Next, again, we're back to this mix rack. So we're doing the same sort of thing we did. So it's EQ, shaping, and compression. So you can hear here, we are doing some shaping of the sound before, with EQ before the compressor, and then some shaping of the sound after the compressor as well. So we're emphasizing the highs and the lows, taking the low mids out, so anything that's sort of muddy, and then we are taking some of the extreme highs off as well. Then we've got a reasonably aggressive compressor to just kind of take that extreme peak and squash it back down again, so that we've got like that impact from the transient shaper, but it's not totally dominating everything in the mix. And then we're just emphasizing the highs and lows again after the compressor. And then next stage is we want to put a little bit of reverb on the snare drum, because it gives that snare a bit of space, makes it sound large. It might sound extreme when I turn this on, but when you put it in the context of the whole kit, it's not, and especially the mix, it doesn't sound as bad. So let's turn this on. So yeah, sounds quite extreme, bit 80s, but it's not really too bad in the context of the whole mix. And then finally, despite my best efforts to remove all of the cymbals with the gate, there's still one particular frequency that seems to get through. So we're doing a very like a scalpel notch EQ here. So it's right around the sort of like 4.2K region. You can hear it's got rid of most of it. Yeah, it's subtle, but it needs to be done. So that's our sort of the snare. And then, as you've seen before, as we discussed before, I have reinforced these samples with MIDI. And let me show you what that sounds like. There we go. So the majority of that sort of body of the sound is coming from your actual snare track, but we're adding a bit of snap in with the program I'm using is called Dictive Drums. You won't find this for sale any longer. I pirated this about 20 years ago and I've been using it for 20 years. But any MIDI triggered drum sample kit will work. And I'll take you through now how we are triggering these MIDI samples. So you might have noticed earlier I had regate, which is actually a noise gate, which is a standard plugin in Reaper. And normally you'd use it similar to this one to sort of take out background noise by just setting a level at which the gate will open and close. When it's open, it lets sound through. When it closes, it stops any sound from getting through. I've set it so that the trigger is active, but it's not actually doing anything to the sound. So the wet, which is the affected sound where the gate is opening sorry, where the gate's opening and closing and stopping background noise, but we have something else doing that. We have this, so that's fine. And then I've got it set so that the gate opens here. The gate opens when the snare is hit. You can see that. When it goes past, it opens the gate. And I've got it to send, when the gate opens, I've got it to send a MIDI command on note 37, which is the note on the MIDI sort of keyboard roll that would trigger the snare sample over here. But obviously, we can see here on this yellow bar on the snare mic track, it's triggering that MIDI symbol, that's it, MIDI signal, but we don't want it on this track. We want the MIDI signal to be triggered on this MIDI samples track here. So, what you do is called send and receive, and you do that in Reaper this way. So we've got our MIDIs triggering on the snare mic one here, and we want it in this MIDI samples track here. So you click root on the MIDI samples track, and then you'd add receive, and then you would click Add Snare Mic. So we're adding a receive, which is the signal is being sent to this track and then received. But then we turn the volume on the snare mic all the way down so that you can't actually hear it through this track. But even though you can't hear it, you can see here that the MIDI trigger is still being sent, and then that triggers the snare on here. And we're doing the same thing with our bass drum. Although the trigger's not on there. We're doing the same thing with our bass drum and with our toms as well. So now you know how that's done, and whenever the samples are being reinforced, it's being done that way. So let's now cover the bass drum. So you got two bass drum mics. You got the inside bass drum, which is like the clickier one, and then you got the other bass drum mic, which is like the more bassy body of the sound. So processing's relatively simple. All I'm doing is doing a gate. So we're doing our gate here. And then for the clicky one, I'm using the transient shaper again. Well, first I'm compressing to sort of even out the sounds, because not all of the hits are consistent, and compressing it makes them all sort of a more similar level. Then I'm transient shaping them just to add a bit more attack to that click, and then I'm taking the sustain down to make that shorter, to make it a shorter hit. So you're just getting a, as you can hear, just a click, 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 click. Very short. Right, and then moving on to the other one. Very similar, but we're doing a lot more EQ work on this one. So, and this is also the one that I'm using to trigger. So regate's just being used as a trigger again. So turn it on. Doing our gate. And then we're doing transient shaping. So again, very similar. We want to keep it quite short. And then we're doing a lot of EQ work, taking the low mids out, really boosting the lows and the highs, and then we're compressing the whole thing to just make sure that things are sounding consistent. Yeah, put those together. This is what we sound like. And then if you see here, both these bass drum tracks are inserted into a bus, a bass drum bus or folder. You might already know about these in Reaper, but I'll let you know about them anyway. A folder is when you put other tracks inside of another track, so that track then becomes kind of like the master of the tracks below it. So you can set the levels of these two, but then this one will control everything, will control both of these, the overall output, and any effects you put on the folder track will affect all of the tracks underneath it. So how you create those, this is just create a new track, and then if you want to put any tracks or folders with other tracks in it into that and create a bus, and a bus is basically, it's called a bus because it's carrying all the other tracks within it like a bus. And all you do is you just click on the track here, take it up to the track you want to put it into a folder of, where you see the blue line, go to the right, and then when the blue line then shortens on the left hand side, boom, there you go, and it's in a folder. So, useful tip for you there. And then both of these drum tracks here, what I'm doing to process them is I'm just doing some dynamics processing and some EQ work again. So some saturation like I did before. It makes quite a big difference actually. So we're doing we're not doing anything before we get to the compressor. This is here, but it's not really doing anything at all. Then we're doing some relatively heavy compression, then quite a lot of saturation. So in place of this virtual mix rack, which you have to pay for, you could just use the Reaper compressor and then Reaper saturation, then Reaper EQ. Then after our saturation, we're doing some more EQ, so taking low mids, really boosting the lows, really boosting the highs. And then finally we are reinforcing with the MIDI samples. So now we have the core sound of our kit, really, with the overheads as well. Yeah, it's a good sound. Now, when it came to your tom tracks, there was a lot of noise in them because they're quite resonant toms, so there's a lot of rumble behind them. So all I'm doing, these don't really come into the actual mix at all. All I'm doing is using the key hits and taking to trigger the MIDI toms, and not really doing anything else, with the exception of this third tom here, because a lot of the tom work you're doing in the verses and the bridge they're quite subtle. I just literally cut out what wasn't needed, but then actually put the full tracks into the mix, and they are real. The other toms are not. So let's listen to those. Oh, let's turn on the effects, sorry, the triggers. So your tom 1 and tom 2, they are not real. But your tom 3, that is real. So this is the real sound, the third tom, but the other two are not. Okay. And then final thing we do before the actual processing on the drums bus itself is, for the bits that are not being triggered, I'm sending them to a reverb, to a track. I'm sending them all to a track here, and then putting like a room simulation reverb on them, so just sort of adds a bit more sort of dimension. Like if you were in a studio, you might have a room mic further out from the kit that just gives it a bit more sort of space. So let's put that on here. Quite subtle. Doesn't make much difference, but when you compress it, it does. And finally, we put every single drum track into a master drum bus. And then what we do processing wise for the drum bus is a lot of compression and limiting, basically. So compression smooths out the peaks and sort of brings a bit more detail into the kit, sort of squashes it, makes it sound better. So we're turning the effects on, we'll turn it on one by one. So we're doing taking some very minor loads out and then compressing. You can hear that sort of brings a bit of punch to it. And then we're doing some really aggressive compressing, and we're sort of setting that at the level of where the bass and snare drum goes. And it's like a super fast attack. Then we're doing some very basic limiting. So we're just adding layers of compression until we got it sounding like we need. And then finally, I'm doing a bit of EQ to just sort of make it feel a bit more modern. So taking most of the mids out and then taking the highs and lows a bit higher. There you go. Then we have a finished drum track. You can see there's a lot of processing you have to do to a drum kit to like really make it sound like a modern rock or metal track. The difference is quite stark from just like even a well-recorded kit won't sound that amazing without quite a lot of work. But it's a long video, but hopefully it gives you a little bit of an idea of what you need to do in order to get things sounding right. There is a list of free plugins that I can send you that might help you. Some of the ones I'm using here you'd have to pay for, and I've collected over like a couple of decades. So you wouldn't be using the exact same things that I am, but there's plenty of free and cheaper stuff out there if you're sort of serious about this that can get you most of the way. Anyway, hope it's been helpful. Cheers. Bye.